Welcome to the third and last learning session for the day. The title of this session is Rebuilding Lives, Empowering Communities After Conflict or Natural Disaster. This morning we heard a lot about how JSDF has been pivotal, starting with the Asian financial crisis and moving then into other crises until the emergency window became a permanent window under the program last year to support the preservation, the reestablishment of the human fabric after disasters and both man-made and natural-made disasters. And I wanted to welcome the panel members this afternoon. Our chair is Inger Andersson, Vice President for the Social Development Network of the World Bank. And I also wanted to introduce briefly by name all the panel members. We have Rod Snyder, Senior Technical Advisor with the American Red Cross. We have Rungawi Pichaykul, Senior Program Coordinator from the Asia Foundation in Bangkok. Following is Ian Bannon, Sector Manager in the Africa region. And finally, we have Saroj Kumar Jha, who's Program Manager for the JFDRR. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and many thanks to my fellow panelists for being here, and thank you to the audience also for coming. We're very excited about having this last anchor session today, where we're going to be talking about rebuilding lives and empowering communities after conflict or natural disasters. And we have a very powerful panel composition here, and I'll ask my fellow panelists to introduce themselves. We look forward to a very interactive dialogue, also very much engaging with the audience. But maybe I start with you, Rod, Sure. If you would say a little bit about who you are, where you are at, and how you encountered the JSDF.
Excellent. Hi, my name is Rod Snyder. I'm a Senior Advisor for Disaster Preparedness at the American Red Cross. I came into this headquarters position via the field. I started as a Peace Corps volunteer in Kenya, ended up wanting to stay in the field, so I worked in Somalia for 2 years on small business development, microcredit, so post-conflict. Went from there to Afghanistan, Pakistan, worked on cross-border issues and setting up offices in Afghanistan, again around small business development, but part of a multi-sector team. That was pre-9/11. Then I went from there and worked in Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh after the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, again working on livelihoods, microcredit type of things. From there I went to Serbia and lived in Serbia for 2 years, working on cross-border issues between Serbia and Kosovo, again very focused around small business development, livelihoods, getting people to rebuild their lives. From there, I went to Indonesia and was a country director for an NGO doing multi-sector work. And I happened to be in Indonesia when the tsunami hit. And so I went up to Banda Aceh. I was up in Banda Aceh within about 7 days after the tsunami and spent 8 months up there leading a multi-sector response and recovery project. After that, I went to Pakistan, was a team leader for Save the Children for their part of their Pakistan response, spent 8 months again, doing multi-sector response and recovery. And then I felt it was time to move back home. And so I've been based in headquarters at Save the Children. And then I moved to American Red Cross and got a little, not necessarily tired, but wanted to change gears a little bit, slow life down. And so I don't respond to emergency anymore. I flipped to the other side and now work on disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation at the American Red Cross, providing technical assistance to our global portfolio.
Very good.
And the JSDF, there's just been different panels that we've been on, and then and some of my team has been on other working groups with some of the JSDF, and they asked me to come.
Very good. Thank you very much. Let's ask Ms. Rungawi also to say a little bit about where she's at, where she comes from, and her engagement with the JSDF.
Thank you. My name is Rungawi Pichaykul. I'm a Senior Program Coordinator at the Asia Foundation, Bangkok, Thailand. Asia Foundation has 18 offices around Asia, and the newest one is India. I'm responsible for the program related to law and governance, women empowerment, human trafficking, how do you call, legal aid, legal aids, and other things related to communities and women's empowerment. Asia Foundation Bangkok, Thailand received quite a moderate grant from the World Bank and JSDF to provide legal aid and counseling to the survivor of tsunami in 2006 until 2009. So the program has been complete with success.
Thank you very much. I should tell you that Ms. Ruang Ravi flew in this morning, so she's at 3 a.m. Bangkok time. So we have to feed her lots of coffee and make sure that that we hear her voice, because she's come a long way to work with us, and we really appreciate that you came. Let me turn to Ian Bannon. If you'd like to also tell us a little bit about yourself and also your engagement and experience with the JSDF.
Yeah, sure. I'm currently the sector manager for fragile states, conflict-affected states, and social development in the Africa region. But my involvement with the JSDF goes quite a long way. I think I'm probably now the longest-standing member of the JSDF committee. So I'm the bad guy who sits in the committee and makes nasty questions about all the proposals that we look at. So I see every proposal that comes in. That's been for about 5 years. And let me tell you that in my career in the bank, I've sat in a lot of committees. That's what happens when you stay around this place for very long. You end up being in a lot of committees. And I can tell you that the JSDF committee is the one that looks at the proposals with tremendous amount of seriousness. And we ponder and we debate among ourselves and we ask very tough questions. So it's been very rewarding, not only because we're the kinds of projects that we get in the committee, but also the scrutiny that each of the concepts and the projects are subjected to. And I know sometimes we're not terribly popular with TTLs, but trust me, we do it with the best of intentions. By background also, over the last about 10 years or so, I have tended to work in conflict-affected countries in all capacities, as working in projects, doing analytical work. And so I come more to this session from the angle of man-made disasters rather than natural disasters. So although I did dabble a little bit with my colleague from the, what is it, JSDF? I could never get the acronym right. And so we did work a little bit together on some of the natural disasters. So it's a great pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you. And then last but certainly not least, let me ask Saroj Jha to say a little bit about himself and also his engagement with JSDF. Yes.
Thank you, Inge. My name is Saroj Jha, and I'm the program manager of Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, which is World Bank's partnership with United Nations and about 36 governments and 5 other international organizations. This was established in 2006. This is today the leading global mechanism for working towards a very strong disaster risk reduction agenda as an important component of development in disaster-prone countries. Introducing myself, I think I would just like to share with you something which is very personal, but I think this is the forum where I would like to share. Bank didn't hire me for that kind of work which I did in the past, but this is something I have within me, is that one fine day I realized that one part of the state where I was working long back in '99, about 20,000 people died and about 100,000 we lost cattle in the affected area. And what I did was basically which nobody else was willing to do, and that was basically to take care of dead bodies and animal carcasses. And the armed forces had declared that this entire area has to be evacuated because we are not able to deal with the dead bodies. And that's what I did for 20 days. And this led me to understand that when we talk about rebuilding lives, what it means actually is very tough. It really takes the best of development professionals to really give your best with all these sectors working together to really help community to rebuild. And that basically changed my perception. I was a civil servant, but then I realized that disaster risk reduction has to be central to anything and everything we do. And I continue to believe in this. And with more and more floods that we are experiencing from Australia to Brazil to South Africa to Colombia to Albania, I think we've got to take it much more seriously. That's what I believe in. That's my introduction. When it comes to JSDF, I think I have contributed in many ways. Since I have a central kind of a responsibility in the bank to look at how we can do more on disaster risk reduction, I think JSDF supported programs have pioneered many of the very successful community-led interventions, not just on post-disaster reconstruction, but also on helping communities to prepare, cope with the future events. And Honduras project, which I see presented here, is a very good success story, which is now being used in several programs in East Asia, in South Asia, and also increasingly in Africa now. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, those introductions. Really, so this is who we are. We are going to make a segue now. As you know, there is a study which is called Starting Over, Starting Better, which describes JSDF and its work in emergency situations. And we're going to segue into a little 7-minute film, which we will roll right now.
JSDF projects aren't there for the huge amounts of money they provide. They're there for the ideas they can generate. And so that's true of all JSDF projects. And we were looking not so much with a conflict lens at these as with a JSDF lens at projects in conflict or disaster-prone situations. So is it harder there? Yes. Is it much harder, especially in conflict? Yes. Can it still work? Or should JSDF not be in those places? I would think that our conclusions were it can definitely work. In some cases it hasn't, but in a lot of cases it has. I don't think the distribution looks any worse than you would expect. I think the success stories and the almost success stories give lots of room for encouragement. And that what we found was our paper lists a number of projects where things were taken up. Other donors stepped in. Governments adopted concepts from the projects for their larger policies. Even in some conflict-affected areas. Now, the sample was heavily affected by Afghanistan in terms of dollars, but there are plenty of other countries where we have plenty of other lessons, and Afghanistan has been studied to a considerable degree, and it is in many ways a success story from that point of view. But there are others that don't have to follow just that model, and that I think we're very encouraged. And one of the questions that comes out of this for us is a little bit of a mystery of why it isn't being done more. I'm curious, is it because not enough people know? Is it because there's not enough need? Is it because we have the wrong approach? We think we came up with a fairly consistent approach that shows it can happen, but for some reason, we only found 41 projects over the last 10 years that we could call conflict-affected and disaster-prone. And so we found a lot of explanations for each project, and it's very difficult to aggregate in general. I think what we ended up doing was looking at patterns that seemed to emerge, not leap out, but emerge, and that came up in discussions or were constantly mentioned in papers. And of those patterns, and what would logically make a project not succeed on our terms, which is if it just didn't have enough publicity and documentation and evaluation. It's an old story. But it matters much more here because JSDF is not, in bank terms, a knowledge product, but a lot of what it creates is knowledge. And if nobody talks about the knowledge, nobody writes the knowledge, then you're lost. So M&E is an issue that's been around, and it's an issue that's been hard for everybody. But by goodness, we've got to make it work in this case, because that's where JSDF is really triumphing, is when they do it right, as they did in Vietnam, as they did in Indonesia, as they have done in Pakistan, on a more local basis, but still, they got some uptake in Pakistan Health. When you do M&E right, that was one of our key findings, is that, sorry if you're bored, guys, but it really matters here, and you've got to keep trying harder.
What we came up with is the JSDF projects in these emergency settings are most likely to be effective when projects were linked or some kind had a relationship with a larger, either it's a bank project or it is a GF, global environmental facility. The chances are that it becomes a bit more visible. And also from the implementing agency side, they probably feel that, you know, they can economize on time and bureaucracy. The other one, finding that we are reporting in the paper is that institutional changes take time. Now, JSDF projects are time-bound. They're probably 3 to 4 years period. And we've seen is when they're given these projects to really be successful and sustainable and replicable, is that if the ideas, let's say in the first phase, and then there is a bit more time to expand those ideas a bit more, learn a bit more, it is much it gives a better result. And examples are, for instance, the JSDF is supporting what they call the first Widows Project, which was the project in Indonesia after the Aceh, because they found out, studies have found that widows were women were disproportionately affected by conflict, and it's the same with also in terms of disaster. So although the bank was providing funds for a major project, KDP, but it was not able to, for whatever reason, address the issues of widows. So JSDF came up with a modest sum to help them, and it built this organization called PECA, and JSDF gave subsequent grants to PECA. It is now a very large organization, very well established, and it is probably in our discussion, it looked like they are able to self-sustain. Just having one shot approach or a single shot approach may not be the best way to demonstrate JSDF success. Number one. Number two, also the amount of money, which is 2 million, probably is a bit too little. Maybe we should be thinking about having, you know, maybe the second grant to be a bit, and you know, JSDF has shown that through PECA and through Afghanistan, that repeated projects, you know, do deliver better results.
But if I were coming from Mars, and I looked at what the conflict people say and the conflict analysts say about is necessary with a conflict lens of any development intervention, and I looked at JSDF's guiding principles, I would say they were made for each other. Conflict may not be the best place for anybody, including JSDF, but JSDF sounds like one of the best suited instruments for use in a post-conflict setting or an at-risk setting. It is flexible. It is community-driven. It works in the local context, and one of the guiding principles of conflict settings, you have to be context sensitive. You have to understand conflict risk factors and drivers, and you have to not upset sensibilities. A JSDF project, by insisting on the community-driven aspect and by being small and therefore not likely to be something hijacked or envied or disruptive, is perfectly suited to paying close sensitivity to that, to attention to that sensitivity. And I think that in the places where it's practically worked, and in some cases like Congo, it may have worked. It's just that for lack of M&E, we can't tell, and for lack of follow-up and money to see whether things have been sustained. In those places, it's done remarkably well. I think from my reading, and there has been some dispute, but I think we did well in Senegal. And then it didn't go the last step. I think we did well in Congo, and it may or may not have gone another step, but we can't tell. I think it seems to have done fairly well in Sierra Leone. All of the post-conflict looked in Africa that we looked at least promising and maybe successful. But again, with lack of good M&E, not only are you setting yourself up for not succeeding, you're setting yourself up for succeeding and nobody knowing, which is too bad in this context. In another project, you can succeed and nobody knows it, and the people get the benefit, and it's great. In the JSDF project, you succeed and nobody knows it. You didn't really do everything you were supposed to do. One of the things that we found over and over again was projects that had established dialogues between entities that hadn't had them before, either the community and the local government, or an NGO and government, or different, even in some cases, different people and locally created institutions for planning and so forth. That's going to presumptively spread dignity, although they didn't say so. I can't see how it can be otherwise. Freedom from fear in terms of increasing your own power as a local community, as a marginalized population that's now included, as removal of the alien, rather than necessarily, you know, the guns are still there, but maybe you think a little better, you've talked a little more to the people behind them.
The other aspect that we have observed is that the choice of the implementing agencies. A number of projects that we said could have had the potential to do really great things but could not, was because it was probably not the right choice, be it the NGO or be it the implementing agency with the government agency. Examples in point. In Indonesia, in the post-tsunami, there was a project on community housing reconstruction. The choice of the NGO, this was a very well-known, internationally reputable NGO who has been dealing with housing in post-disaster situation. But for a community-driven program, this NGO was probably not the right one suited. And also the NGO also had never worked with the government department, the ministry, which was the parent implementing ministry. And the ministry never did work with an NGO.
I have heard people say that there isn't a demand, and that's why we don't need to increase the size of the program. I wouldn't wait for demand. I think JSDF projects have shown that it's perfectly possible to deliver innovative, community-driven projects in conflict-affected and disaster-prone settings. And I don't know why we're waiting around. I do know that, like a lot of people, we've had difficulties with monitoring, we've had difficulties with evaluation, and I think that rather than saying, so why haven't we done better already, there's no harm in continuing to emphasize and improve on that. I don't want to not bring that up just because people are going to be blamed. You know, I'm not interested in the blame. Let's fix it because we've shown we can do it. A few times is enough for me. We've only really tried a few times. You know, there are very few terrible failures because it was a conflict situation. Conflict is hard for everybody.
Because both the government of Japan providing this money to us and the bank staff who have implemented these projects have done a tremendous job in being able to work under very in dire circumstances with the NGOs or with the government or with the community. But none of these innovations are really well known. And that is what can be done by the JSDF Secretariat to be able to do those much more.
So that really allowed us to see what the authors of this study, Bill Webster and Wahida Haq, summarized for us. What are the opportunities that the JSDF offers for us in conflict and in post-conflict and post-disaster situations, and are we taking adequate advantage of this tool? And so we have a number of guests, and we introduced ourselves before, and let me start with Ms. Ruengravi. And because you received support from JSDF, and you said a modest amount, and rightly so, for legal aid. So that's interesting. Now, what has that got to do with post-disasters? And can you explain to us and to the audience how this worked and what the Asia Foundation actually did to roll out this program?
Thank you, Inga. Let me tell the story instead of, read the report one more time. After this 26th December 2004, I went down to the Andaman coast where the tsunami hit very hardly over there in Thailand too. That killed more than 5,000 people, almost 100 still missing, and left more than 1,000 orphans, children over there. So I went there as a volunteer in the same time do assessment. I see all the, humanitarian aids pouring into the area. Oh, you lost boat, we give boat. Or you lost house, we give house, whatever, medical cares and everything. But I met one family, she lost 5 members. She's 65 years old, a lady who didn't read, write Thai, and she's Muslim. Now she's taking care of 5 children because her son-in-law died son-in-law, daughter, husbands, like the mothers and father of grandchildren. She just stay home. Why people came and lined up, for assistance. She didn't know why. We met these kind of vulnerable groups. That would strike me. Why didn't she go there? Who gonna take care of these orphans? They don't have any legal document. That's why they cannot line up, because most of father and mother dies. They never get married properly. They have a common law marriage. So these children become no guardians and cannot access to any kinds of assistance, even provided, for everyone. But the legal identity become an issue that prevents so many people to get access to services. That would strike me the first thing. And the more we talk to the people, we meet with the people, we even found some old problems occur time to time. For example, the land dispute, the land ownership dispute, where like companies and some of the I don't know how to say that, like grab the lands or try to claim that lands. They become dispute everywhere. Big issue. And this is we have legal issue that divided it two. One is legal, we call litigations, and non-litigation. Non-litigation, they have no opposed parties. If you are orphans and you have to be adopted, you need a document, or inheritance, a death certificate, some kind of that. But the big problem is about land ownership issue. So we found this kind of thing is under carpet for many years. So it's kind of, like open up. Then we set up the office in Krabi, starting with 4 staff. And imagine that, when we opened the legal aid, people were storming to receive service from us. It's quiet. Nobody came. Even though we disseminate, announce, introduce through radio to government officials, to everyone. Why not? Nobody comes because they don't know whether they have the legal issue, the legal problems. So now we start to go out and outreach, door knocks, do mobile clinics, and we found out every time we go to meet with the people, we said, oh, do you have legal problems? People said, oh, I never fight with anyone. I don't have any. We have to spend time, each family, to explain what is the legal problem is. Like even the man taking care of 5 children in front of him, he doesn't have any legal guardians over them because the mother died, and according to Thai law, all children belong to mother only. So this kind of thing. So we explain individual families, on this kind of thing. And in the community, we cannot reach everywhere. So we're thinking about people who are living there. We recruit paralegals, villagers, and affected survivors who are volunteer to work with us. So we train them, equip them with knowledge, introduce them to the court, to the public prosecutor, to the police, and then they can run the legal issue themselves, the proceedings themselves. And we provide them with some stipends or transportation. And from paralegals, we start to realize that some groups, some vulnerable people are left out. We kind of scan the area and found, for examples, there are Buddhist women. Why she didn't get any kind of compensation or join the economics opportunity scheme or something like that? She said, how could I join? Because I want to raise pig. Why the group are all Muslim? Like this kind of thing. So we are able to provide them with some small grant to start up. We found so many people left out because we went there 1 year after the tsunami. We started 2006. It's kind of, like look around and see what is left out. So we come. I think the key issue that we think we are so successful in that we are provide rights and legal status to the people that they can access to services. That's number 1. Number 2, all problem has been redressed, or land ownership, citizenship so many people there don't have the ID card, so they cannot do anything, scholarship, health, employment. So they've been deprived their rights. And number 3, I think using people in the area, resources, community resources, is one of the things that we're so proud of, because these people are become a resource person in the area afterward. And finally, this kind of models is become a best model for us too. So now we replicated this kind of legal aid model in the southern conflict, where there's a conflict in the southern of Thailand, and also in Laos, where there's a lot of minority ethnic, like mountainous area. So paralegal will be, best practices for this program.
So this is very interesting because it tells us about the many dimensions to the JSDF, which is innovative and piloting. Moving on to, you told us about a very impressive career moving from one place of catastrophe to the next and putting your shoulder to the wheel. A little bit about your experience, and maybe speaking from the platform now of the Red Cross, Rod, but this business about community involvement in risk reduction, which is clearly part of what we heard from the short clip, and part of what I think in your experience very much that you've dealt with. Could you speak a little bit about this?
Absolutely, and let me just even back up. It was just struck me when I was looking at that, and just think of the term itself, Japanese Social Development Fund, development in relief and recovery. And I think it's exactly what is needed, and we're in a growth business. It's very unfortunate, but just with population growth and urbanization, we're going to see more disasters. If you add climate change onto that, as we're anticipating, that's going to further exacerbate it. Oxfam's Right to Survive study came out that right now 250 million people annually are affected by disasters. By 2015, in 4 years, that's going to increase by 50%. That's 350 million people a year. And you think about the Australian floods, the Pakistan floods that we're all consuming of the entire country, or very big parts of the country. We are going to be faced more and more with these type of disasters, and we have to do a lot better at preparing for them and being able to respond to them. And I think one of our challenges are that the development field and the humanitarian field are separate. They're dual mandates, and we need to figure out how to work those together better. And then even in disaster response, a lot of times you have response and recovery, and so there's a disparate transition between those three of those. And I think disaster risk reduction, if we put that lens on development, which again, it's a challenge because disaster risk reduction is often housed in humanitarian departments, but where we will see it is a development issue at getting at the underlying causes of development. And I think we talk about one of the biggest impediments to the Millennium Development Goals is disasters. And so I think if the development starts taking on disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation as part of a key to their development, we will transition much better. And that has to happen at the community level. We're seeing from the Red Cross particularly, we think we're first responders, and we're not. It's the community that's the first responder. Haiti, we saw, it's your neighbor that's responding. It's your neighbor that needs to know first aid. It's your neighbor that needs to know light search and rescue. It's your neighbor that's going to be the first one to help you. And so it really is a challenge that we need to build safer, more resilient communities is the terminology we use at the community level, and it has to do be a community-based approach. But with that said, it has to be linked. We have to do better at what we call end-to-end programming. So we do get to the last mile, so you get down to those vulnerable communities that are at risk, but it needs to be tied to governments and NGOs and national or civil society at a district, sub-regional, regional, national level. There has to be those linkages there, especially as we see larger development or larger scale disasters, right, and new disasters that we're not experiencing. And I think another point is that we're seeing in Haiti, and I've been to Haiti a few times since the earthquake, and I think the international community writ large needs to understand urban disasters much better. It's a very different challenge, and I would argue that international NGOs are largely steeped in rural development, and we have to get much better at the urban side. And again, I think it's doing it before and not after. And so it's really, if not, we're going to be overwhelmed.
You make some really good points, and I'm going to move to Saroj because you also work on the disaster side, and then we'll come to the, what did you call them, the man-made disasters, i.e. wars and conflict in a little while. But this business of scaling up, Saroj, and the business of, you know, how do you said the first responder has to be at the community level, has to be your neighbor sort of thing. How, and your team working with GFDRR, but also with the JSDF as you know it, how do we take these lessons that we're learning, and how do we then, what is it that we need to do differently to help that communities become more resilient? What are the things we need to do differently?
Thank you, Inger. I think first thing that we need to do is to make sure that when we have a country-level policy dialogue in framing the disaster risk reduction policy, which many countries are doing now on their own with the help of UN, with the help of the World Bank and several partners at the country level, what we are experiencing is that the importance of community-based disaster risk reduction is not adequately highlighted in the national policies. You'd find it is very top-driven, it is focused on what the different ministries will do, what the agencies will do. It doesn't really take into account the importance of community-based disaster risk reduction into the policy dialogue. So I think it is important that the lessons from JSDF work, particularly in terms of what works and how it has worked and why it has worked, we feed that into the policy dialogue into the countries. Some of this is happening. For example, I was referring to Honduras project, which really helped frame the issues and what works into several country-level policies and also new investment projects. The second, I think, which is important is where we see a role for us to be also working with a number of partners, including International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent and their national societies in the country. And this is something we are trying to build now, a strong partnership with the national societies of Red Cross and Red Crescent, because they have these auxiliary status when it comes to the government, and they are in a very important position to bring stories from the ground in terms of how community-based disaster preparedness, risk reduction has been very effective. And we have a very strong partnership with Red Cross and Red Crescent. What I would like to do going forward is to bring the JSDF lessons and also work more closely with the JSDF Secretariat so that our partnership with the Red Cross and Red Crescent in some of the disaster-prone countries, we make the community-based issues central to the national policies. That will help the governments to scale up and do the community-based disaster risk reduction at large scale, because otherwise we are talking about only pilots and all the time. We've been talking about community-based DRR for the last 15 years. I think the governments need to make it central to their DRR policies and use their resources to scale it up. We have opportunities, we have the evidence, and I think, as I said, my commitment going forward is that I would basically take JSDF's lessons and the knowledge that they have on this, perhaps create some more evidence if needed, but be very targeting in the sense, look at 20 disaster-prone countries and say in the next 3 years, this is the kind of scaling up we'll achieve through the policy dialogue and the design of investments that we are working with the government in those countries.
So that's very helpful, because I think you're right. You know, this is the thing that the global community has been struggling with, how to create that resilience at the community level. The same story happens in the post-conflict setting. How is it that we can work on the community angle to help these countries and these communities reconstruct in a post-conflict setting? So you said that you've been one of the longest travelers on the JSDF train. So one of the questions that I had, and based on the findings from Bill and Wahida, the authors of the studies, why is it that they were sort of indicating and signaling there's not enough uptake? So what's the story here, Ian, and how do we rectify that?
I was hoping the audience would help us a little bit try to answer the question. We go through this, a couple of thoughts. One, having worked in this area for a long time, I'm afraid that despite the fact that we're doing a WDR, I don't really believe that conflict.
That's a World Development Report.
Sorry, World Development Report,
yeah.
which is the flagship of the bank every year. I don't think that conflict is still embedded in the way the bank does business. I think there is still an attitude which predominates that we're there to pick up the rubble. We're there to fix things once the shooting has stopped. And despite the fact that we have tremendous evidence of all kinds of very brave TTLs, very imaginative, creative TTLs, finding ways to work.
TTLs, these are the people who manage our projects.
Sorry, these are sorry. Any staff who figure out a way, either using a grant, using a partner like the Red Cross, using the UN system to find a way for us to stay engaged. Despite that, we still see, even in the Africa region, which is a region that is still unfortunately beset by fragility and conflict, we still find some of our colleagues or managers say to us, oh, the bank has no comparative advantage. This is not for the bank. And so there's still very much this attitude, wait until it's safe. In the meantime, it's NGOs and the UN system that has to deal with this problem. We'll come in later and clean things up. And that is a very prehistoric attitude that is very, very difficult to change. So I think some of our staff colleagues who want to do something very often do find this immediate reaction that is, why do you want to do that? That is very dangerous. There's reputational risk. We could be doing things wrong. Why not just wait and be risk averse? I think that's one of it. A lot of it, the other thing I think is where I think the JSDF, and not just the JSDF, but we have a number of competing funds. I can think of at least 4 trust funds who are very major, but who have slightly different objectives, slightly different procedures. BNPP has now a window on conflict. TFESSD occasionally will venture into some aspects of conflict or fragility. The State and Peace Building Fund is another one, and a JSDF. So I think sometimes TTLs, task managers, or people who have an idea are a little bit overwhelmed, and they say, well, okay, which one's got the least bureaucracy? Okay, which one actually gives me some BB budget? And you know, that's a very important one. So I think that is still part of the reaction, but I would absolutely love to hear anybody that has any ideas. And let me just, since I got the floor, let me just make a slight comment on the community-based approach.
Please.
Community-based approach, that's not the issue. I think we've known this for at least 2 decades, that these approaches, whether it be conflict or natural disaster, have to be community-based. The problem is how to do it. It's not whether to do it, it's how to do it. And it is complicated. It's not easy. We sit in the committee and we get proposals that, you know, we start to critique or criticize, and the reaction is, but it's community-based. The fact that it's community-based doesn't make it good. It doesn't mean it's going to be effective. The cleverness has to be in how you design the community-based. What is it? What are the elements? What are the contextual elements? What are the institutions that you're working with? What are the instruments that you're using? And that is complicated. So there's a little bit sometimes a presumption that if I just do something community-based, it will be okay. And somebody will give me money to go and do it. And I think the role of the JSDF has been very valuable in that sense, in saying, yes, but. And I think that's something that would love to hear some more views from the panel or from the audience.
So let me ask Rod, because you've done lots of community-based work, about the how. What does that look like? Because you're right, of course, it's like motherhood and apple pie. Nobody would be opposed to community-based. But what are some of the answers on the how? And then afterwards I'll come to you on the same question. Then I think we'll open it up to a broader discussion.
I'm not sure I got the answers, but I know it's a challenge, and I was going to make that comment. And I'll just give an example of post-tsunami, when the American Red Cross had quite a bit of resources through generous donations, and the Federation had resources. We had resource intensive access, and we ended up doing community-based disaster risk reduction in 100 communities throughout Banda Aceh. The Federation at whole did 400 communities. And I think that's one of the largest community-based disaster risk reduction projects that's ever really been done worldwide, and it sounds really big. It is nothing. 400 communities is nothing in Indonesia when you have 17,000 islands and 250 population in one of the most at-risk places. And so it gets back to this issue of scalability and sustainability. And it's something that we're really trying to figure out. we have to absolutely have community-based participatory approaches, but I think we need to find better models on how to scale that up. And I do think the evidence is there, and so I agree with you, Mr. Suraj, that we're, especially in disaster risk reduction, we're in this constant pilot testing phase. We're also in this constant phase of, most of the evidence is anecdotal, and so we still don't, I mean, we need better evidence on this is what really is going to reduce risk. Is that is that early warning, setting up response teams, doing micro mitigation? What are these real things that are going to reduce the risk of those communities, and how can we have a more efficient delivery mechanism and service delivery to do that? Right now our approach is we go in, it's a participatory approach. We use what's called a vulnerability capacity assessment, which is extremely important. The communities, even that in itself, getting a community to understand the risks that it faces, what threats it faces, and that it does have the capacity, even the most poor marginalized communities have a capacity to be able to prepare and respond and reduce their risk. That in itself, just getting communities to understand and know their risk is a huge step, let alone taking them down further steps into doing disaster preparedness that eventually gets into disaster risk reduction, which gets at the underlying causes of risk, which is, you know, poverty, marginalization, these kind of things. But it's absolutely the right question.
One of the things that we saw in the little clip there was that the emphasis that, look, institutional change takes time. That was, you know, it's not something you can turn on a dime. And I think the experience that you were reflecting on from Thailand is one of working at the very, very, very grassroots with actually the most fundamental of changes in people's rights, the people's recognition on land rights and so on. What would you say in terms of building that capacity from the ground up and the kind of time scale that you would see for making those kind of results more sustainable in the long run?
When we begin this one, it doesn't mean that, you know, we go directly to work with the community right away. We work with the public prosecutors, talk to judges that work with us, and so this is the first time too. I was so how do you call it, amazed by the link between judges, courts along the Andaman coast, and on the public prosecutors. Open free services, because these people bring, cases to them. But the problem is, how can we locate resources in community? That was one of I think the most challenges, because they are anywhere. We found that the most effective, the most affected groups are the ones who are become committed to solve their own problem. That's I try to define, community based. It doesn't mean that we doing something in the communities, but there are people who, a group of people, or a class of people, a class action group of people would like to stand up and solve their own problem. It's quite an issue based rather than the area based, something like that. And talking about scaling up, every time we work related to legal judicial process, we have to, because every case has to go to the court system, judicial system, and we need cooperation from both. And at the end of the project, we learned that the government has tried to do the same thing. They try to train the paralegals, and they call justice volunteer. It's the same type, And also on the citizenship, we provide some funds for people to do the DNA test for the people who are having Thai ID card, and some relatives, children doesn't have ID card, but we do the DNA to prove the relationship. This kind of thing has been replicated at the parliament. The parliaments also proposed to the government to have some funds. So this kind of thing, everything we do, we try to push as the policy, as well as, we are not so skillful in disaster reductions, but we found some lessons from communities which teach us, this is a small story. we do the workshop we call CPLG, Civic Participation in Local Governance. So we have to work with local government in the same time. Ban Nam Kem is the one who was hit the most, like more than 1,000 people killed in one spot area. So people thinking about having a basket, like a sky basket, a towels, when the next tsunami comes, so they can be safe. But after we provide them with the participatory kind of workshop, then people think of, oh, why don't we look at the resources? How many resources, building the database, the men, the women, the elderly, the young, and then I know all the information about themselves. Where's the high land? And then, it was so impressive that they stopped thinking about building the sky basket anymore because they make 3 tracks. Okay, when tsunami comes, this track is for widows and young, and there must be a response team, like a rescue team together with them. This one to what for the truck, this track. They stopped talking about towers and anymore. Just management and think together. So this is just my experiments, my experience, and I'm thinking about, like, how do you call, expand this kind of idea to other places.
So the idea is to ensure that we listen and that we understand what is needed at the ground level, and maybe here the question for the sort of internal bank people. This JSDF, it has a fairly limited lifespan. Each project, it's 2 to 3 years. Is this what we should be doing? And then I'll ask you on knowledge, and then we're going to turn it around, knowledge sharing.
2 thoughts, and let me pick up one of the remarks that one of the authors mentioned. He said, Senegal, we're not sure if it worked. Well, it did work. It worked beautifully. A project followed from the JSDF, and the innovation was not community-based public works or anything like that. It was that the communities decided that they needed a space. They needed a space to talk about conflict that was affecting them, and they themselves found the sort of mediation mechanisms, and it became a safe space. And that got picked up by a project. That was the most innovative part of the project. That was the part that people least paid attention to. It had a sort of infrastructure component, it had a training component. Those were the people that people were interested in talking about. This one that everybody left aside. And this morning we were talking about a follow-on project, and this is the part that we're rescuing. This is the part that we think is absolutely important. So it does happen. It just, I don't know what it is, but we don't do a good job of publicizing it. We don't sort of shine the spotlight on it and say, people, this is important. This is neat. This is cool. This is the bank at its best. And so maybe the JSDF needs to do a better job because we're too busy. In the regions, we just don't have the time or resources to blow our own trumpets. So we perhaps need a little bit of hand-holding to sort of go outside the region. On the question of institutions, you can still do pilots if they're well designed within the JSDF limitations. But in the committee, we do sit there and think, yeah, this needs more nurturing, needs more water, more fertilizer before you begin to see the results. So if there was a possibility to open up that conversation, it would be the details around it, because you don't want the JSDF to be a constant source of funding, that you're on JSDF number 10. But what are the conditions under which a follow-on JSDF, or if you like an Apple type of JSDF, where you say, look, if you meet these conditions, we will consider a second phase. I think that certainly would be something that would be very, very
interesting
welcome.
Thought. So this issue, in Senegal, actually it worked well, but they hadn't blown their trumpet. What do we need to do inside the bank and the World Bank Group and with our many partners with whom we are working, NGOs, donors, etc., to ensure that knowledge flows and these lessons flow? You work in disaster risk mitigation and response. That's a very fast-moving field. How can we move lessons from the two and ensure that the knowledge flow is more fluid?
I think, first of all, I think the exchange of knowledge among the disaster risk reduction community, bank, UN, international organizations, civil society organizations, Red Cross and Red Crescent, I think it's a very close community now, and there is very good exchange of lessons and experiences. And I just wanted to give an example, the question on how to do community-based disaster risk reduction. The Vietnam government's policy on this, precisely this issue in 2010 is a very good example. It's a 10-page government order explaining basically how the government is going to scale up and make it a universal program for the entire country based on the experiences from NGOs project in South Vietnam to USAID-funded UNDP project in some other part of the country and so on and so forth. And that has now been picked up also by many other countries in East Asia. Now, coming to the issue of community-based, I still would like to say community-based because it is about putting community at the center of the entire debate, discussion, policy, investment, financing, monitoring the impact. I think the lessons from JSDF, first of all, we need to do a better job on documentation. I'm not sure whether JSDF has the budget for doing more documentation. I think that would certainly help us. We would like to work with the JSDF partners and many others to see how we can increase our capacity to do more documentation in terms of the lessons in different projects around the world and feed into this knowledge network that we have across the world, both international and national organizations. The second is that we also need to document what has not worked. Often we talked about only good practices, and we never talk about bad practices as if the bad practices did not exist. And while we know that there are many projects, many pilots which did not work at all. So it's also important to look at them. And the last point I want to make, which is basically giving a different spin to this question, Inger, you asked me, which has bothered me for quite some time. And it's also a question to colleagues working on the social family within the World Bank. Every crisis, be it natural hazard, it is never a natural disaster, by the way. It is always unnatural. Natural hazards cause disasters. Natural hazards and conflict, whenever we have a trigger and we have a crisis, is always an opportunity for social rebuilding, social reconstruction. And sometimes I fail to understand as to why we miss this opportunity, and this question is to all of us actually. And the last major earthquake in Haiti was a very good example. And I'm trying to see how JSDF going forward, whatever life it has, and what we have learned from pilot projects in the past can be used to really focus a lot more on social reconstruction. We often do a lot actually on physical infrastructure reconstruction, which is great, and we must do that. But it is also important that we emphasize social reconstruction. And I think this is a debate that we need to have more, and I think JSDF can provide that space to have that discussion, because I think we are basically avoiding that, many of us who are in the front line in engaging on the issue of rebuilding lives.
Thank you very much.
Inger, can I make a couple points on that?
Yes, you may, but now we're going to incorporate the audience in the thing. So what we're going to do is to try to, we have about 20 minutes or so to go. So what we'd like to do, I believe that there are microphones, Roberto, somewhere in the audience. Probably the audience can see the microphones. We can't see them. Oh, there's one right over there. We can carry one. So what we'd like to do is to open it up for any comments, or what we really like to do is to have a conversation. So less speeches and more sort of issues that we can then raise. And maybe if you could please introduce yourself and tell us where you work, that would be helpful. So we will we'll say that the floor is open, particularly obviously on this whole story around response to disasters, be they post-conflict and reconstruction in that regard, or be it in a following up on a natural disaster. While people are thinking about this, I'm going to turn to you, because there was something you wanted to come in on.
Well, it goes back to this funding cycle. And again, this is, I mentioned in my opening statements about DRR being housed in humanitarian field. And so what you end up doing is getting 1 and 2 year funding cycles, and it's very hard to plan. And so again, it's getting back to the donors and saying community-based efforts take time, and that to do a good plan, we're saying it's 3 to 5 years, but it's very hard because donors have very short funding cycles, particularly when you're around humanitarian fields. I remember working in Pakistan, again, pre-9/11, in communities that had been displaced for 19 years, but I was still on 1 year funding cycles, and it's just extremely difficult to make any real social development when you can only plan on 1 year, and you can't rely on that next year. And so something we've talked within the disaster risk reduction community is getting the donors to start adding disaster risk reduction as almost a compliance of project design and proposal design, as M&E is now. M&E now is required by both donors. You have to have an M&E plan, and you have to have a sustainability plan. We would like to say, if you're going to be doing development, whether it's in water and sanitation, livelihoods, what have you thought about the disaster risk, and how are you going to protect and mitigate against that?
So that's something I'm still looking to see if there are hands, but I don't see any, so we'll continue. There is? Okay. So please, to the person who has a comment, please. We can't see you. Now I can see you. That's very good.
Thank you.
Please.
Hello, my name is Morris Kofa. I'm from the Africa Environmental Watch, but I actually work for the District of Columbia Department of the Environment. My question really has to do with this whole idea of natural disaster. I just returned from Liberia a week ago, and as many of you may know, Liberia just came out of war, 14 years. It's a major conflict. Post-war development is going on. And one thing that I noticed from this discussion is that the issue of putting in place an effective risk management plan in Liberia, perhaps in the whole of Africa, is not quite effective. I wonder what can JSFD do in considering what has been transpiring from climate perspective. We all do understand, calling from the conversation from the panelists, that Africa is one of the continents, or perhaps the continent that is more impacted as a result of climate change. Africa only contributes less than 4% of the total greenhouse gas that is trapped into our atmosphere. And over China and America and the rest of the country are merely responsible for the impact that is devastating Africa today. But we do not see an effective plan that the World Bank has put in place to actually deal with risk management in Africa. I wonder if JSFD is prepared to take that role to carry out a more robust program in creating risk assessment and risk management in Africa from a mitigation perspective with respect to preparedness, recovery, respond from a community-based approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. And maybe what I'll do is I'll ask you to speak a little bit on the kind of program that the bank has responded on in Liberia, just to give our guests a sense of that. And then maybe also speak about the scope and scale of JSDF itself, which is slightly different from the broader climate story.
Yeah, I'll let you guys do the climate.
Yeah, I'll take care of it.
Yes, absolutely. I think, let's be very clear, I think Liberia was devastated after the war. And it's devastation, not just a physical devastation, economic devastation, but as Sarosh says, it's in need of social reconstruction. Designing a plan is a very easy thing to do. We can all lock ourselves up in a door and go to the Liberians and say, here's a plan to mitigate risk. But I think the process has to be internal to that society, to that body politic. And it requires some institutional capacity. It cannot just be done by consultants flying in and saying, let's prepare a plan and we're all ready. That is a process that takes a long time. It needs to be owned by the Liberians. And that is a process that Liberians have to come to. And we can accompany them, we can help them, but it has to be a locally owned process. That is what takes us time. In a way, the physical reconstruction is the easy part. This is an engineering problem. But getting a society, getting the right institutions so that if you have a plan, the plan actually gets implemented. That's an institutional issue. You have to have an institution to actually implement the plan. That, unfortunately, we don't have any magic bullets. This is you a bit like Haiti, you're almost starting from zero, ground zero in a case like Liberia. JSDF can play a tremendous role in all kinds of risk mitigation. But again, we always have to, it's a partnership. And it's a slow process of getting the country to own this or any other plan. The rest is, I think, what Saroj quite rightly pointed out. This is the countries that come out of a conflict are deeply divided. They're deeply divided ethnically, politically, socially, in all aspects. And so part of the reconstruction is rebuilding those social ties and rebuilding that positive social capital. All I can tell you is that in most of the countries that we work in, we should have a horizon that's at least 10 years. In these places, 10 years is the short term. So rebuilding a country that is completely devastated, if you start thinking, well, what can I do in 1 or 2 years, I think you're missing the point completely. So I'm sorry not to have a very clear, transparent answer that says, if only you do this, we will solve the problem. It is incredibly complicated, and it takes an enormous amount of time.
Thank you very much for that. On the climate issue, I mean, it's a very important aspect, obviously, and one that some of us on this panel are also very much engaged in. What I would say is that that's perhaps not the main thrust of the JSDF, but we have many other funds that precisely seek to do this, and certainly in Liberia, that's also an engagement that we have, but it's probably a little bit outside the scope of on the adaptation side. Having said that, though, preparedness, precisely, and I think you talked about that, is very much part and parcel of a climate-changing world. And much of what we're seeing with respect to many of these frequent events that you were talking about, Saroj, is certainly a function of that. Let's see if there are other comments from the audience or questions or concerns that guests or colleagues would like to raise.
There's one here in the corner.
Please go right ahead.
David Potter, a bank retiree. Rod Snyder made the comment that there's, following natural hazard related disasters, there's often a lot of funds that pour into countries. JSDF projects take a very long time to mature from a proposal to implementation. There are, as Ian Bannon mentioned, there are a lot of other programs in the bank which address these issues. Do you think JSDF really has a comparative advantage in working with projects in either post-disaster or post-natural hazard disaster situations?
Thank you. That's a nice question. It falls to you. Yes.
The conflict side.
No, the business about whether...
I'm not here representing
no, but you are the
JSDF.
one who knows more about it than the rest of us on the panel, so you get the pleasure.
No, I would say if the objective is a humanitarian emergency one, then the JSDF is probably the wrong place to go. There are other mechanisms and there are other funding sources that do that much better than the JSDF. However, if what you're trying to do is link the community-based aspect with using the window of opportunity that a disaster provides to build resilience for the next event, then I would say by all means come to the JSDF and we will try to move it as fast as we can, but recognize that we're not the fire engine. We're not going to put up the fire for you. We're going to try to help you make the thing fire resistant. And if you come to us with a proposal that looks at how to engage the community, what are the mechanisms, how you will do it, what are the innovations that you want to pilot and you want to try, then we're open for business. Please do come to us.
So let's ask one of our clients, what was your experience with this humongous bureaucracy in Washington that turns paper at a snail's pace?
But anyway, for this project, I think it's quite smoother, flexible. And,
they didn't pay her to say this.
Yeah,
we just flew
I know that so many. We receive so many funders, right? Asia Foundation,
yeah,
right?
Big foundation.
Sometimes 6, 7 in the same time. I manage right now 5 funding sources. So, but for JSDF, this is just in addition to some of the guests saying about M&E, right? Monitoring and evaluation. I myself would like to really encourage, how do you call it? Institutional change takes time, or community empowerment takes time. For example, I'm really curious to know what happened to my area that I finished 2 years ago. We provide a legal identity to people, over 1,000 people over there. Only $120 per person for the DNA test. These people start to get access to scholarship, to health care, that all the government's welfare scheme. And they now can own properties. They buy land, they buy cars, they employ, like the wage, the salary increase. I think it's more, how do you call it? It's multiplies.
Sure.
Yeah, the economics value of that already. And this kind of thing, I'm really curious to know what happened to them. And how many of them run for local election? Sure. Because we kept hearing that, like some of our paralegals now become a representative in local governments. So we would like to go back and see, this is something that if there are some funds set aside, maybe 1 year or 2 years, because we cannot shift other funds to do this kind of project. So this is some recommendations.
No, that's actually a very nice pick-up point, and I think the video bore out the importance of having a strong M&E framework, but about the sort of post-learning, post-end of project learning, it's a significant point, and thank you for raising that. Rod, was there a point that you wanted to come in on this issue of, you started many small enterprises, and so in terms of monitoring and ensuring that these enterprises continue post-end of project, could you speak? Because that kind of seems to be the same issue in terms of sustainability. Then we'll go back out again, and then I think we'll wrap it up.
And a really quick comment, not all disasters are well funded, and I think some disasters, we have the hidden disasters, and again, I think that might be a good avenue for the fund as well, to look at some, and those are usually the protracted ones, the Congo, Darfur, Chad, some of these things. So just want to clarify that point. Livelihoods, and this is something that I've advocated for a long time, livelihoods starts on day one after a disaster. And livelihoods often gets pushed off onto, oh, that's a development, or that needs to, we're not ready for that, we just have to do distribution or do life saving. Livelihoods happens on day one, and so we need to start having better strategies to address that. But it needs to be, some of my experience from livelihoods is a lot of it is supply driven, and then we end up providing resources that aren't used effectively, and so we need to do a lot better at demand driven, really looking at what is the market forces in that area, how do we make them sustainable, how do we make sure that that they're being addressed properly. I mean, there's the stories of Indonesia, the company or the NGO bringing in the flat bottom boats that don't bounce in the waves and they just break. And so we need, and that was just bringing in nets and fishing boats, which wasn't sustainable. So I think my point on that would be, if we're going to do livelihoods, which should happen day one, it needs to be demand driven, and we need to be a lot more smart about how we address that.
Thank you. I am getting the signal that since we are running on time, and this is all webcast and camera recorded, etc. So let me try to wrap up some of the things that I think we've heard, and also thanking very much my fellow panelists here. First of all, I think we heard very much that the JSDF has been this secret weapon is a wrong word, but this secret tool that has enabled the bank and NGO partners to reach out in a post-disaster, post-conflict situation. I think we also heard that there is room, there is a room at the inn, and that this is open for business, and it is a tool and an instrument that works well, but an instrument that wants to move beyond pilots. It's also an instrument that has tried innovations that are of an extraordinary impact, such as what we've heard, the real story from Thailand, which is absolutely impressive and significant, and something to really learn from. But I think we've also learned that institutional changes are not fast. This is something that takes the time. You give the 10-year time frame for making sure that actually this turnaround happens. At the same time, I think we hear that knowledge has to move and knowledge has to be shared. We are learning lessons from these things, and we're not wanting to stay in the pilot mode. We want to scale up as well. We also understand that, yes, community-based I love the idea of the first responder is your neighbor. So the idea of this has to be community-based, absolutely, but what kind of community-based? How do we define that? And so that's important to get that right. And finally, I think the whole story around monitoring and evaluation, it's important in the design, it's important in the rollout, but I think your point is absolutely significant. What happens after we close the shop? And a 2-year period, 3-year period, how did this work? Was it taken up? Was it mainstreamed by the government? How did people fare? Were there other funders that came in? So I think what we've done today has been a really useful airing of how the JSDF can work in post-disasters and post-conflict. And I want to thank you, the audience, and my fellow panelists for having a very, very successful session. I hope that we will be able to continue working on the JSDF precisely for these kind of things. And I hope that the JSDF Secretariat will do, what was it you said? Blow the trumpet, because the trumpet needs to be blown. Thank you very much indeed.